Thank you. Thank you all for coming out at lunchtime. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Andrew. I'm honored by the presence of everyone here, and I'm grateful to Heritage for this opportunity to talk about how the West really lost God. Just a couple of weeks ago, a report in Great Britain made headline news. It argued that based on the 2011 census numbers, it looked as if Christians would be a minority of the population there even sooner than originally predicted, specifically within the decade. That's just one more datum in what looks to be the steady and accelerating pattern of secularization in Western Europe. The purpose of my book is to consider that pattern and the related pattern of secularization in the United States and elsewhere in the West in a new way. So one thing I can say for sure is that the new book doesn't paint on a small canvas. It's about God, Western civilization, men, women, the sexual revolution, theology, sociology, and a few other things. And if we left any of the big themes out, then I'm sure the critics will put them in, as they often do when a generalist like me goes lumbering through academic turf. But in defense of such intellectual trespassing, I offer this thought. The question of how societies that were once religious become less so is one of the most interesting intellectual puzzles in the world. It's especially interesting if you spend any time in Western Europe, where Christianity has become a boutique practice in many places, quite despite the massive and singular influence that it's had on arts, letters, laws, and history until very recently, including, though not only, on aesthetic achievements that stand at the very pinnacle of human accomplishment. Even without going to Europe, the question of how religion's hold has loosened over the Western mind and Western civilization remains an object of armchair fascination. After all, as noted, our laws, customs, arts, literature, etc., owe more to Judeo-Christianity than to any other single tradition. And that's just one reason why all of us, believers or agnostics or atheists, would seem to have a born interest in figuring out something about this puzzle of Western secularization, because we carry remnants and sometimes more of that Judeo-Christian tradition inside us, whether we want to or not. It's just part of what you might call our individual cultural and historical DNA. Once upon a time, for a great many people, in what was once called Christendom, the Judeo-Christian code governed the details of daily life from dawn until dusk, to say nothing of the momentous passages of birth, marriage, death, and other human milestones. Obviously, this is true no more for many modern Western people. A growing number of us greet the milestones of life with no religious framework at all. Some are born without being baptized. Many have children without being married. Some contract civil marriages instead of religious ones if they do marry at all. We darken church doors infrequently, if ever, and upon dying, many of our bodies are incinerated and scattered to the winds, rather than prayed over whole in the ground, as Christian ritual and dogma had hitherto commanded. And these are just a few examples of the sea change known as secularization. Many more could be added to the list. So what happened? How did significant swaths of the Western world go from being societies that widely feared God to societies that in some places now widely jeer him? That's the essence of the puzzle about Western secularization, and I do mean the word puzzle literally. Many times during the years that went into this book, it felt as if I were sitting at a table with a giant jigsaw puzzle spread out in front of me, and some days pushing the pieces this way, some days that way. And then there were days when they would just fall into place the way they do when you've discovered a pattern, and suddenly a lot of them stop being isolated pieces and line up the way they should. So it is with this puzzle. Industrialization, modern science, rationalism, feminism, family change, new atheism, urbanization, where do each of these separate forces fit into the big picture of secularization? Little by little, I came to the conclusion that the conventional storyline of secularization, although full of truth in certain ways, had gotten something pretty big wrong. It was as if modernity has pressed together all the pieces of this great puzzle in a way that looks right from a distance, but that a closer look reveals to be forced, not the right fit. And it was in the quest for a better fit of those pieces that the book, How the West Really Lost God, came about. So today I would like to sketch briefly some of the reasons why the pieces of the puzzle don't fit together the way we've been told they do. And then I'd like to explain what seems to have gone missing and offer a sketch of evidence for this contrarian view. The first problem with conventional ways of explaining secularization has to do with the historical timeline. Secularization has been understood by most great modern thinkers, and for that matter, plenty of mediocre ones, as a linear process in which religion slowly but surely vanishes from the earth, or at least from its more sophisticated precincts. As people become more educated and more prosperous, the collective story goes, these same people come to find themselves more skeptical of religion's premises. They find themselves less needful of religion's presumed consolations. And hence, somewhere in the long run, many people have thought, religion, or specifically the Christianity once dominant on the European continent, will just die out. This could take a while. Friedrich Nietzsche famously predicted in his parable of the madman that it would take, quote, hundreds and hundreds of years for the news of God's death to reach everyone. But again, no matter how long it would take, there's been a kind of post-Enlightenment consensus, at least among secular thinkers, that in the long run, to paraphrase John Maynard Keynes in another context, God will be dead. Now, exactly which feature of modernity would do this has been unclear. But once again, it should be stressed, this process has been assumed by many people to be inexorable, like lit candles on a birthday cake. It's been conjectured. The religious faithful of the advanced West will sooner or later wink out until nobody's left. On inspection, there are several logical problems with this idea, including insurmountable ones. First, the conventional storyline does not describe the reality of Christianity's persistence in the world. American sociologist of religion Rodney Stark, who is a contrarian in these matters, wrote a lively essay in 1999 that's something of a classic. It was called Secularization, Rest in Peace, and it opened with an entertaining review of predictions of the demise of the Christian faith, going back to 1660 and continuing up to the present day, including but not limited to such secular prophets as Frederick the Great, Thomas Jefferson, Auguste Comte, Friedrich Engels, Sigmund Freud, and others. As Stark wryly implied, a lot of people proclaiming the death of God didn't get the fact that their own obituaries would be written long before the deities. Plainly, as he points out, the Almighty has not expired on the timeline predicted. And as a side note, the new atheists who are vocally frustrated about exactly this point, that is, Christianity's persistence in the world, would be the first to agree with him. So, that's problem one with the conventional storyline. Here's another one. Contrary to widely held stereotype, belief in the Christian God also isn't a straight-out function of social class or education. And this stereotype, too, is deeply ingrained. We saw this, for instance, a few years back, when the President of the United States unthinkingly repeated just this stereotype in singling out jobless rural people who supposedly, quote, cling to their guns and their religion. The implication was clear. Religion is something that embittered and poor people do. In this, the president was just reiterating a view offered many times before. Christianity, in the minds of many sophisticated secular people, is Karl Marx's famous opiate of the masses, a consolation prize for the poor and backward. Many people just take it for granted that the better off have less use for God than the worse off, and that smart and educated people have less use for religion than duller people. To be fair to President Obama, he's not the only one to have put that stereotype out there. Remember a somewhat notorious piece in the Washington Post 10 years ago now that described the followers of leading American evangelicals as, quote, largely poor, uneducated, and easy to command, unquote. Those are immortal words. Everyone knows these things, and yet, in actual fact, few people who believe in these stereotypes know the empirical truth. Once again, if the conventional account of secularization were correct, if it predicted who was religious and why, then we would reasonably expect to find that the poorer and less educated people are, the more religious they would be. So the fact that these stereotypes are not correct and that we can point to cases where the opposite is true means once again that the conventional understanding of secularization has missed something. Here's an example.